find their oath, the law, and the Constitution. In Pennsylvania, we use the statewide Uniform Registry of Electors, or the SURE system, as the basis of determining who can vote. Unfortunately, a recent attempted audit by the Democrat State Auditor General concluded that he was unable to establish with any degree of reasonable assurance that the SURE system is secure and that Pennsylvania voter registration records are complete and accurate. That's what we're relying on, ladies and gentlemen. That right there. This is the very same system used to certify the election in the contest for President of the United States. This is the very same system that the state used to certify the 2020 election, even though its figures do not match more than half of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. To this day, right now, while we stand here, how can this election be certified using a system that after 2 months still displays that over 205,000 more votes were cast in Pennsylvania than people who voted in the November election? Let me say that again. 205,000 more votes than voters.
Time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the objection.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, to my colleague from Pennsylvania, I will say this. I carry the same Constitution that you do. And the Constitution, sir, does not allow you, me, or any member of this body to substitute our judgment for that of the American people. It does not allow us to disregard the will of the American people. Because under this Constitution, under our Constitution, Congress doesn't choose the president. The American people do. And they have chosen in resounding numbers, as every single member of this body well understands. Now, I have been at a loss, Madam Speaker, to explain what happened today, but there's a statement that I found that largely summarized my thoughts on the matter. The scenes of mayhem unfolding at the seat of our nation's government are a sickening and heartbreaking sight. This is how election results are disputed in a banana republic, not our democratic republic. I am appalled by the reckless behavior of some political leaders since the election and by the lack of respect shown today for our institutions, our traditions, and our law enforcement. The violent assault on the Capitol and the disruption of a constitutionally mandated meeting of Congress was undertaken by people whose passions have been inflamed by falsehoods and false hopes. Insurrection could do grave damage.
Majority Leader. If there's no further debate, the question shall be, shall the objection submitted by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, the senator from Missouri, Mr. Hawley, be sustained? Is there a sufficient second? The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Rich. Mr. Rich, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tulliverville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Ms. Harris? Ms. Harris, no. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane, no. No.
Mr. Sanders, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 92. The objection is not sustained. The Secretary will notify the House of the action of the Senate, informing that body that the Senate is now ready to proceed to joint session with further counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, for the information of all of our colleagues, we don't expect additional votes tonight. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that upon the dissolution of the joint session, the Senate stand adjourned to then convene for pro forma sessions only, with no business being conducted on the following dates and times, and that following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn to the next pro forma session. Friday, January the 8th at 10 a.m., Tuesday, January 12th at 12:30 p.m., Friday, January the 15th at 10 a.m. I further ask that when the Senate adjourns on Friday, January 15th, it next convene at 12 noon on Tuesday, January 19th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, time for the two leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. Finally, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection,